My name is Daniel Pratchett. I'm 41 years old, and I have been to exactly one wedding in my life. Mine. I left before they even brought out the cake. People always ask me if I regret leaving early, and the truth is, I think about that night for a different reason than they expect. Not the humiliation, the quiet. There's a kind of stillness that comes over you right before you do something you can't take back. And I want to tell you about that stillness, because everything that mattered happened inside it. But to understand why I stood up in front of 400 people and walked out on my own wedding, you have to go back to a kitchen table in Toledo, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning when I was 11 years old. My father, Walter Pratchett, ran a small appliance repair shop on Dorr Street. Pratchett and Son, the sign said, even though I never once worked there as a kid. Not really, just swept floors and handed him wrenches on Saturdays. He wore the same navy work jacket with his name stitched over the pocket for as long as I can remember, and he drove a Ford pickup with 240,000 miles on it that he kept running himself because, as he put it, why pay a man to do what you can do yourself? We weren't poor. We weren't rich either. The lights stayed on, there was always food on the table, and twice a year we drove to Cedar Point for the day, and my father would buy exactly one funnel cake to split between us. Because that was the tradition, and he didn't believe in changing traditions just because you could afford to. He wasn't a talker. He read the newspaper at the kitchen table every morning before the sun was all the way up. And if you asked him a question he didn't want to answer, he'd just keep reading until you gave up asking. There was a locked metal cabinet in the back of his shop that I wasn't allowed to touch. I assumed it was tools, important customer records maybe. I never thought twice about it, the way you never think twice about the furniture that's always been in a room. There was one thing, though, that I noticed even as a kid. Every couple of years, some local business association or chamber of commerce would send him an invitation to some dinner or another, an awards banquet, a networking thing downtown. I saw the envelopes pile up on the counter of the shop unopened, until eventually they stopped coming, because he never replied to a single one. I asked him about it once. He looked at me over his coffee and said, I don't need a room full of strangers telling me I matter, Danny. I already know. That was the whole conversation. I was 16 and didn't understand what he meant. I do now. My mother, Carol, passed when I was 23. Breast cancer, fast and merciless. And after that, it was just the two of us, my father and me, two men who didn't talk about feelings sitting across a table from each other on Sunday nights eating whatever he'd thrown together. I moved to Columbus for work not long after, got into commercial insurance underwriting, and built a decent life for myself. I'd visit Toledo once a month, sometimes less when work got busy, and every time I left, my father would stand in the driveway and wave until I turned the corner, the same way he had since I was a kid leaving for college. I met Vanessa Bellwether at a charity gala. Of all places, one of those black tie fundraisers my company bought a table at every year that I usually hated. She was sharp and funny in a way that caught me off guard. The kind of funny that has an edge to it, and she made fun of the bad shrimp cocktail before anyone else dared to. I liked her immediately. She told me later that what drew her to me was that I didn't seem impressed by any of it, the venue, the silent auction, the string quartet. I told her the truth, which was that none of it impressed me because none of it was real to me. I grew up around real things. A truck that needed an oil change. A roof that leaked in March. Vanessa's family lived in New Albany, in one of those neighborhoods where every house looks like it was designed by committee to be slightly more impressive than the one next to it. Her father, Gordon Ashworth, was in commercial development, big shopping plazas, mixed-use complexes, the kind of projects that get a press release when they break ground. Her mother, Marjorie, ran their household, and from what I could tell, most of their social calendar too, the country club luncheons, the charity boards, the seating charts for everything. The first time Marjorie met my father was at a dinner. I still wish I could unremember. He drove down in the truck. Vanessa's eyes flicked to it for half a second through the front window, and then she smiled at me like nothing had happened. I filed that away and didn't say anything. I was 29 and in love and willing to overlook a lot. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. I remember exactly where, at the overlook off the Scioto River bike path. No ring box theatrics, no flash mob. Just me getting down on one knee while a guy jogged past us giving an awkward thumbs up. She cried, said yes, and we started planning a wedding for the following June. Somewhere in that stretch of time, I turned down a regional director position in Chicago. Better money, better title, the kind of job I'd been working toward for a decade. I stayed because Vanessa was building her interior design business in Columbus and didn't want to start over somewhere new. And because, if I'm honest, I didn't want to be the guy who put his career over the relationship. I have thought about that decision more than I'd like to admit since everything that happened. The wedding planning brought out a side of the Ashworth family I hadn't fully seen before. Marjorie took over almost everything: the venue, the florist, the band. All of it routed through her like she was running a small corporation. I let it happen because Vanessa let it happen, and because picking battles over centerpieces felt beneath both of us. My father stayed mostly quiet through all of it. When Marjorie called him directly one afternoon to ask, with a little too much emphasis, whether he owned a proper suit or if they needed to make arrangements, he just said, "I'll be dressed fine, Marjorie. Don't you worry about me." He told me about the call that weekend, laughing it off, but I noticed he didn't laugh as easily as he used to. About 4 months before the wedding, my father had what the doctors called a mild cardiac event. Nothing fatal, but enough to put him in the hospital for 3 days. I drove to Toledo the moment I heard. Vanessa came with me the first day, sat in the waiting room scrolling her phone, and by the second day had a work conflict that kept her in Columbus. I understood. Businesses don't pause for in-laws' health scares, but something about the ease with which she let me go alone stuck with me in a way I didn't examine closely enough at the time. My father pulled through fine. The cardiologist told him to slow down, eat better, the standard speech. My father nodded along and then went back to the shop 2 days after he was discharged, against every instruction he'd been given. "I've got customers waiting on their dryers, Danny. Heart attack or not." That was him completely, stubborn as bedrock, and somehow that stubbornness had always felt like safety to me. Like as long as he kept showing up to that shop every morning, the world was still arranged the way it should be. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in June, at a vineyard estate outside of New Albany that Marjorie had reserved a year and a half in advance. 400 guests. String lights strung across a lawn that rolled down toward a pond. A band Marjorie's friend had personally vetted. My father wore a suit he'd bought off the rack at a men's warehouse in Toledo 2 weeks before. Navy, simple. And he'd had it altered himself with pins he kept in an old cigar box, because he didn't trust the alterations counter to get the sleeve length right. He showed up early, before most of the family, and stood near the edge of the lawn under one of the oak trees, alone, looking out at the pond like he was at peace with exactly where he was standing. The ceremony went fine. Vows, rings, the whole thing, beautiful in the way these things are supposed to be beautiful. It was at the reception, during the toasts, that everything started to come apart. Marjorie had the microphone for what was supposed to be a short welcome before dinner. She thanked everyone for coming, made a joke about June weather, the usual opening pleasantries. Then she said she wanted to acknowledge the two families coming together, and she gestured first to Gordon's side of the tent, listing off names, titles, companies, like she was reading a program at a business conference. Then she turned, almost as an afterthought, toward where my father was sitting at our table, and she said, with a little laugh threaded through it, "And of course, we have Walter, representing the working man side of things. Salt of the earth, this one." A ripple of laughter went through parts of the tent, the kind of laughter that knows exactly what it's doing while pretending it's harmless. I watched my father's face. He didn't flinch. He just folded his hands on the table in front of him and looked straight ahead, the same way he used to look at me over the newspaper when I'd asked for something unreasonable as a kid. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. Later, during the toasts, Gordon's business partner, a man named Russell Thackeray, stood up with a champagne flute, already half empty, and decided he was funny enough to follow Marjorie's lead. He raised his glass toward our table and said, loud enough for half the tent to hear, "To Walter, who fixes washing machines for a living, and somehow raised a son sharp enough to land in this family. Must run in the water in Toledo." More laughter. Someone near the back actually clapped. I looked at Vanessa. I needed her to say something, to do anything, a look, a word, a hand on my arm, some small signal that she saw what I saw. Instead, she was looking down at the table, and at the corner of her mouth there was the faintest trace of a smile, gone half a second after it appeared. But I saw it. I saw it the way you see something you wish you hadn't. I turned back to my father. He hadn't moved. His jaw was set, his hands still folded, but there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to a man absorbing a hit he'd long ago decided not to show. My mother would have stood up. My mother would have said something sharp enough to cut through that whole tent. But she wasn't there, and my father just sat in that silence, like he'd trained himself for it his whole life. I pushed my chair back. 400 people watched me cross that lawn. I walked up to Russell Thackeray, who was still grinning, still pleased with himself, and I asked him to hand me the microphone. He laughed like it was part of the joke until he saw my face and realized it wasn't. I took the mic from his hand. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," I said. "I mean that." The tent had gone quiet, that particular quiet of several hundred people, sensing something is about to happen and not knowing which direction it's going to go. My father drove 2.5 hours to be here today. In a suit he altered himself with a cigar box full of pins, because he didn't want to spend money on something he could do just as well on his own kitchen table. That's not a punchline. That's the most honest man I have ever known in my life, and some of you just stood up and made him into a joke in front of everyone he loves. Nobody laughed this time. I don't know what kind of family makes fun of the people who actually built something real instead of inheriting it, I said, and I felt my voice start to shake. Not from fear, from something else. Something that had been sitting in my chest for 2 years and finally had somewhere to go. But I know I can't marry into one. I'm sorry, Vanessa, I really am, but I can't do this. I set the microphone down on the table, walked to where my father was sitting, and put my hand on his shoulder. He looked up at me, and for the first time all day, something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but close. We walked out of that tent together, the two of us, past 400 silent guests, past the string lights and the rented chairs and the centerpieces Marjorie had spent 8 months agonizing over, and out into the parking lot where his truck was parked crooked in a spot clearly meant for a much smaller vehicle. Neither of us said anything until we were on the highway heading north, Toledo bound, the vineyard shrinking in the rearview mirror. "You didn't have to do that," he finally said. "Yeah, I did," I told him. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and turned the radio to the AM station he always listened to. Some call-in show about high school football recruiting, and we drove the rest of the way in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite conversation either. It was just us, the way it had always been. I stayed at my father's house for the next several weeks. I'd taken a leave of absence from work, told them it was a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie. The house on Brookwood Lane hadn't changed since I was a kid. Same kitchen, same curtains over the sink that had faded a little where the afternoon sun hit them. Same chipped mug my father drank his coffee from every single morning. I slept in my childhood bedroom and woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of the newspaper rustling at the kitchen table, and there was something almost unbearably comforting about how unchanged it all was, how steady after everything that had just collapsed. About 3 weeks in, my father asked me to come down to the shop with him on a Saturday. Said he needed help moving some inventory in the back room. I figured it was just an excuse to get me out of the house, to give me something to do besides replay that wedding in my head on a loop. And I went along with it, because I didn't have a better idea of my own. In the back room, behind a row of old dryer parts, was the locked cabinet I'd grown up seeing and never questioning. My father pulled a key from his pocket, the same plain key I'd seen on his ring my whole life, and opened it for the first time I could ever remember witnessing. Inside were folders, dozens of them, organized by year, by property, by account, bank statements, investment summaries. A folder labeled simply real estate that was 3 inches thick. He handed me the top one without a word. It took me a few minutes of reading to understand what I was looking at. My father, the man who fixed washing machines on Dorr Street for 35 years, had spent the last 2 decades quietly buying up small commercial properties around Toledo and Northwest Ohio, strip malls, warehouse buildings, a couple of apartment complexes, all under a holding company with a name so plain and unremarkable, Brookwood Holdings, that nobody who saw it would ever connect it back to him. He'd started small, he told me, with money he and my mother had saved from the shop in the early years, one duplex at a time, reinvesting everything, never taking distributions, never living any differently than he always had. The numbers in that folder were not small numbers. They were not numbers that belonged to a man who altered his own suit with a cigar box of pins. "Why?" I started, and couldn't find the rest of the sentence. "Because money changes how people look at you," he said, sitting down on an overturned crate, looking older and more tired than I'd seen him look in years. I watched it happen to men I grew up with, the second they made a little. The way people started treating them different. The way they started treating people different right back. I didn't want that for you. I wanted you to grow up knowing what you were worth had nothing to do with what was in an account somewhere. I wanted you to become a man on your own, not in the shadow of mine. And the cardiac thing, I said. Were you ever going to tell me? I was going to tell you the week before the wedding, he said. Then I watched how that family looked at this shop, looked at this truck, looked at me, and I thought, let's see how this plays out first. Let's see what kind of woman is about to become my daughter-in-law, before she has any reason to be nice to me for the wrong reasons. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about every offhand comment Marjorie had made over 2 years, every flick of Vanessa's eyes toward the truck, every small accumulating signal I'd talked myself out of taking seriously, because I wanted the story to end a certain way. My father hadn't just protected himself. He'd protected the truth of who actually loved who, and who was just along for whatever ride looked good on paper. I didn't go back to Vanessa. I heard through a mutual friend a few months later that the wedding venue deposit, fully non-refundable, had become a sore point between her and her parents, that the whole thing had strained relationships I no longer had any stake in. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I mostly just felt tired and a little sad, the way you feel about a house you used to live in that's since been sold to strangers. I moved back to Toledo that fall, took a regional position with my company that let me work mostly from the area, and started spending Sunday evenings at my father's table again, the way we used to, before Columbus, before Vanessa, before any of it. He never once threw the money in my face, never once said, "I told you so" about Vanessa, never changed a single thing about how he lived. Same truck, same jacket with his name stitched over the pocket, same funnel cake split 2 ways at Cedar Point every summer. A year after the wedding that never happened, I asked him, half joking, if he was ever going to buy a new truck, with all that money sitting in Brookwood Holdings. He looked at me like I had suggested something faintly absurd. "This one still runs," he said. "Why would I?" That was the whole answer, and somehow it was everything I needed to hear. I think about that tent sometimes, the string lights, 400 faces turning toward me, the silence after I set that microphone down. People ask if I regret how it happened, the scene of it, the scale of it. I don't. Not because of what I found out afterward, in that locked cabinet. Not because of the money. Not because of anything that came later. I don't regret it, because my father was sitting 3 feet away from me, when a room full of strangers decided he was something to laugh at, and the only question that mattered in that moment was what kind of son I was going to be. I gave the answer I could live with. Everything else came after.